This knowledge clip is about personality, or more specifically, about the question how stable personality really is. Before we answer that question, first we need to know more about what personality is in the first place. So what is personality? Basically, our personality is what makes us tick. It's our building block, so to speak. So if I would ask you, for example, to describe your personality to me, you'd probably be able to do that pretty accurately. You could describe, for example, whether you're outgoing or not, organized or not, maybe even a bit manipulative or not. And even if I would ask you to describe other people's personalities to me, like friends, family members, even famous people, you'd be able to do that as well. Whether they're accurate or not is a second question, but we all have this very clear, intuitive idea of what personality is. This is because personality is such a fundamental part of who we are. For example, it determines our values, what we find important. It determines our attitudes. It determines our motivation. So our personality has an important role in what makes us go the extra mile in our study, in our work, etc. So personality essentially is a stable organization of characteristics that makes us who we are and that determines how we adapt to our environment. So then the question is, how is personality formed? If this is such an important foundation of our human behavior, how does it come to be in the first place? So there's two opinions on this. If we look at the traditional discussion, we had what we call the nature-nurture debate. And the first part of that is nature, which essentially means our personality is formed by nature, by our genes, by our DNA. If we're born into this world, we have this complete software package in which everything has been programmed. The other side of this debate, nurture, says the opposite. Especially the behaviorists were adamant about this. They said human behaviors are born as clean slates, as tabula rasa, as they called it. Which meant if we're born into this world, we're completely blank. There is not even the smallest bit of software available yet. Every bit of software is written once we have started living. Now obviously these are two pretty extreme views on this matter, and we know by now after decades of research that the truth is somewhere in the middle. So there's nature, yes, there's actually quite a lot in our DNA that already is predetermined when we are born. We all know that children tend to look like their parents, and they also have personality traits that are similar to their parents. But at the same time, a lot of our personality is also formed during our early years. So the way we're raised at home, the way we learn things at school, the friends we hang out with, they're all an important influencing factor in our personality as well. So basically that means there's nature and nurture. Now over the past few decades, an enormous amount of scientific research has been done on how to describe our personality. So in other words, models that describe certain personality traits that are stable in human behavior. And the most famous one of those models is the Big Five. And the Big Five means openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. That's why I put a picture of an ocean here on the slide, because that's an easy way to remember all five of them. O-C-E-A-N. Decades of research on the Big Five across the world. So this is a very valid model of personality traits. Not just research in the US and in Europe, but even in rural African societies that had never seen any form of media or internet before. So we know that these five traits are a clear characteristic of human behavior, and we also know that certain traits of these Big Five are associated, for example, with performance at work, with leadership emergence, with how we behave in groups and teams, etc., etc. Another model is the Hexaco model. It's a more recent model than the Big Five. It's very similar, basically the exact same traits in there, but there's one extra. It's the age of humility and honesty. So that means the researchers that came up with the Hexaco model said, the Big Five is it's a valid model, but if we look at certain cultures, especially more collectivistic Asian cultures, then this humility, honesty dimension is really a crucial part of our personality as well. Then there's proactive personality, which is a personality trait that has become more popular, I would say, during the past 10 years. Proactivity is about how much we're likely to self-initiate certain behaviors. So people scoring high on proactive personality are the types who are not likely to wait for opportunity to come knocking at the door, but who search for opportunities of their own volition. Now we know from abundant research in the last 10 years that proactive personality is important, for example, in better performance, but also in career success. Then there's core self-evaluations, another pretty important and popular stream of literature over the past decade. Core self-evaluations, for example, self-esteem, our general estimation of ourselves, self-efficacy, our perception of how likely it is that we're successfully able to perform certain behaviors. So for example, work-related self-efficacy could be our belief that we're able to do our work successfully. And also locus of control. So is our behavior caused by internal factors? Are we able to influence it? Or is behavior caused by external factors, and are we just like victims of the context? Again, core self-evaluations has been researched a lot, and we know that if people have positive core self-evaluations, which are at the foundation of our personality, that can lead to all kinds of positive outcomes, such as higher well-being at work, higher performance at work, and more life satisfaction and career success. Then there is the dark triad, which has gained popularity over the past few years. And the dark triad, the name already implies that this is kind of a different stream of literature. It's not about being extroverted, conscientious, having positive core self-evaluations. This is about being narcissistic, Machiavellianistic, and non-clinical psychopathy. So these three personality traits are what we call the dark side of personality. Narcissists who have this extremely inflated self-image, who want to be praised all the time. Machiavellianists, the master manipulators, who tend to get what they want and they don't care how they get there. And the psychopaths, so this is not the serial killer type of issue. This is a personality trait. People can score high and low on psychopathy, and they're thrill seekers. So not really thinking about the consequences, but just constantly searching for new things and new stimuli to keep them going. And again, we know that the dark triad traits actually have some positive outcomes. So for example, narcissists tend to get into leadership positions more quickly because people fall into their trap and think they are really as awesome as they portray themselves to be. Similarly, Machiavellianists are people who are very good at manipulating, so they tend to get their way around organizations and are actually quite often in leadership positions as well. Yet, if we look at the long term, usually sooner or later, this extremely high self-image that narcissists have and the manipulating ways of the Machiavellianists, they tend to end up unsuccessfully in the long term because people see through the facade sooner or later. Okay, so this was an overview of what personality is and some of the most famous personality models and traits we know of from science. The question, and that's why this knowledge clip began in the first place, is how stable are personality traits? So if we look at the scientific literature and popular discussions as well, we tend to assume that personality traits are stable. They may form during the early years, so that's the nature side of that debate, but all in all, they don't really change all that much. So essentially the assumption is yes, they're stable. Personality traits cannot be trained, they cannot be altered by the person themselves. Maybe they change somewhat in the early years, but essentially for human resource management, the implication is we can't train it, but we can select on it. So for example, what we often see in organizations nowadays is that they have assessments, and as part of the assessment, candidates sometimes have to do certain assignments, but they also have to fill out certain surveys, and part of those surveys is usually aimed at assessing people's personality traits. For example, in a call center or in a job as a salesperson, It's important that you're agreeable, that people like you. It's important that you're extroverted, that you're outgoing, able to make contact with possible customers. But if we look, for example, as a job as a programmer, then conscientiousness, this organized dimension, is much more important. So organizations tend to select on these personality traits. However, the question is this assumption of stability of personality, is it correct? There's been some research on that, and more specifically, Roberts and colleagues in 2006 did a major study, a meta-analysis on this topic. And so they said the traditional view is personality, yes, it changes, but it mainly changes up until adolescence. After this, it kind of stops changing. So they did a study. They compiled 92 studies of personality change, which meant over 50,000 scores. So they compiled all these 92 studies, gathered all the data, and then did their own analyses on change of personality traits. So what did they find? Did it match the traditional view? Not that much, really. So what they found is that, contrary to popular belief, all Big Five traits show changes after the age of 30. So the traditional assumption is adolescence, childhood, those are the most prominent stages of change, and after 30 it tends to stabilize. These researchers found in a meta-analysis of 92 studies that all Big Five traits changed after age 30. And interestingly, the biggest changes actually happened during young adulthood, so roughly between 20 and 40 years of age. So the major changes didn't happen during adolescence, they happened at a later stage. Right, so let's look at the Big Five personality traits specifically and see how they changed over the course of the lifespan. The first one is emotional stability, which is the opposite of neuroticism. The researchers found that emotional stability increased during the teenage years, up until the age category of 30 to 40 years. So there was this steady increase. People tend to become more emotionally stable. And then after 50, there's a small increase. So the biggest change happens up until 30, 40. That's one big gradual increase. And then it tends to get a bit more between 50 and 60. And afterwards, it remains stable. So all in all, people tend to become more emotionally stable over the lifespan. Extraversion. We can actually see two dimensions here. So the first one is social vitality. So that means how healthy people are. It's kind of obvious that when people get older, their vitality usually decreases somewhat. And we also see in the extraversion dimension that social vitality decreases between 22 and 30. So that's actually quite young. People already start becoming a little bit less socially vital. And then especially between the age of 60 and 70, we see that social vitality goes down. Social dominance, so how dominant people are, and in case of extroversion, this is about dominance in conversations, in social interactions. We see that it gradually increases over time, approximately until age 40. So people tend to become more socially dominant until they're 40 years of age, and afterwards it stabilizes. The third one is openness to new experiences. And we see that this mainly increases during the student years, which is kind of logical because students tend to see a whole new side of the world. A lot of them move, maybe even to another country to study, and so they see many new things, which corresponds to our personality trait of openness increasing during these years, which is a good thing. We do see that it remains stable afterwards. So openness, there is some change after the age of 30, but the most changes happen between 20 and 30, and afterwards it tends to become stable. The fourth one is agreeableness. This is actually the one that changed least of all Big Five traits. So we saw some small increases up until the age of 40, 50, but they're statistically non-significant. So there's small incremental changes. People tend to become a bit more agreeable, but it's not really significant. So there's not a lot going on there. But then after the age of 50, suddenly there's an increase in agreeableness. So people tend to be really stable in their agreeableness up until age 50, and then afterwards people become more agreeable. And the final one, conscientiousness, so how organized we are. We actually see, surprisingly, that there are no changes during adolescence and student years, which for students is a pity, because conscientiousness of the big 5 traits is actually the strongest indicator of academic performance during student years. So basically this means there isn't much you can do about this. You're either conscientious or you're not so much conscientious, and it doesn't tend to change in your student years. However, we do see, and it starts at 20, but the big increase comes after 30, that there's a clear increase. So over the lifespan, people tend to become more conscientious, more organized. So what's the conclusion of this all? Are personality traits stable? Absolutely. So there isn't much you can do to suddenly increase your level of extroversion or conscientiousness. At some point, if you think, I'd like to become more conscientious, there isn't just some training manual you can download or an exercise you can do to suddenly skyrocket on the measure of conscientiousness or extroversion or agreeableness, etc., etc. So yes, personality traits are very much stable. However, they're definitely not unchangeable. So the traditional popular view on people not changing their personality traits, especially after age 30, it's not true. So we should keep into account that personality traits, they actually do change all across the lifespan, not just in early childhood and adolescence. On an interesting note, there's been a lot of research on personality of dogs as well, and animals in general actually. And Fradkin and colleagues in 2013, they did a meta-analysis on personality traits in dogs. And they found a pretty similar result. So they found that the older dogs tend to become, the more stable personality traits are, which is similar to human beings, because the biggest changes happen during young adulthood, and afterwards there are some changes, as we just saw, but they tend to become less strong. There's a very similar development in dogs. So the biggest changes happen during young adulthood, and then when they're older, yes, there can still be changes, but they tend to be smaller. So maybe man's best friend is actually more like us than we have ever thought. So finally, before we wrap this up, if you've never seen this video, it's a TED Talk of Dan Gilbert entitled The Psychology of Your Future Self. Really interesting to watch. This is related to the topic of this knowledge clip. And Dan Gilbert researched if people are able to estimate their own personality change over time. So he asked questions about how do you think you will feel about a certain topic and about your personality in 10 years. And then after 10 years, he asked them again and examined how much they corresponded. If you haven't seen it, check it out. If you go to YouTube and search for Dan Gilbert and the Psychology of Your Future Self, you'll most definitely find it. So this was the knowledge clip about the stability of personality. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any further questions, you can always contact me.